This video will introduce the wild skills map, enemies, their pathing alongside some recommended strategies. Here's the map up on screen. There are two main terrain mechanics on this map, one being the dirt mounds and the other being the sandstorm. If you've played Originium Dust, skip to this timestamp on screen now. Dirt mounds are basically something that protects your operators against the sandstorm in a one-directional fashion. The sandstorm is a mechanic that basically heavily debuffs your operators once it touches them, and the only way to block them is through the dirt mounds. So let's say you have multiple operators in a straight line, the sandstorm will affect all of them. In the context of this contingency contract, sandstorms are basically a mechanic to 1. Time gate your progress so you can't infinitely stall, and 2. A way to restrict your tile placements. This is why this CC has no tile restrictions, because well, half the tiles are already restricted by these risks. Some enemies also have unique interactions with the sandstorm, such as the sand sniper. There are 3 main sandstorm waves in this CC, but we only really care about 2 of them. The first one up on screen now is the week 1 sandstorm, where it's blowing from right to left and the blue lines indicate which operators will be affected by the sandstorm. As for the next one, we have a week 2 risk that changes the sandstorm from blowing from left to right. But this is the one that's very uncommonly seen, given the fact that week 2 also unlocks a second level risk that changes the sandstorm from blowing from top to bottom, which drastically alters the tiles available, and there generally isn't a good reason to go for the risk 1 sandstorm unless it's a very specific strat. Before getting into the enemies, I'd like to take a while to talk about the map info. The important part here is that the initial deployment points for the map is 5, which is substantially lower than the other CCs. What this means is that Texas, or Zima for that matter, is heavily recommended in order to raise your initial DP or initial functional DP so that you can deploy Myrtle earlier. Deployment limit at 9 is fairly standard, and 3 HP seals means that you can leak 2 of the elite enemies. Broadly speaking, there's 3 types of enemies in this map. The first type being basic trash that you don't really need to care about, the second containing enemies that have mechanics you're supposed to work around, and the third being the duelist crocodiles, which are more or less the main threat of the stage. I'll be using informal names for most of the enemies, and they're up on screen now. In our trash tier, we have the generic crocs and the fighter crocs. The generic crocs make up about half of the enemies on the stage, and they're there just to ensure that you have DPS on the stage at all times. They aren't really much of a threat except that they come in really early and DP will be an issue. The fighter crocs are an enemy that you really don't want to block, and soon after the first one spawns, they will redirect the pathing of the generic crocodiles to take a shorter path to the blue box. Although they are much more dangerous on paper, you probably wouldn't be blocking both anyways and just nuking them down with ranged DPS, in which case they're both very squishy. Onto the gimmick enemies. We have 3 of them. Firstly, the caster, then we have the sniper, and lastly the infiltrator. The crocodile casters are some of the enemies that scale the hardest with map risks, given the fact that they're the only source of ranged poke on this map. At lower risks, tanking them with a single medic is a very viable option, but if you're trying to go for mid to high 20s, Nightingale is almost certainly a necessity. The sand snipers are only really there to prevent you from deploying operators inside the sandstorm, alongside forcing you to have a DPS on the right side where no other enemy goes. Their gimmick is that their range is global to any operator that's inside the sandstorm, and at base, without any CC risks, they have 1.5k attack. Dealing with them in melee mode is far easier though, because their melee damage is only 30% of their normal attack, leaving them with a petty 450 attack on base. Although it does scale with CC risks, it's still something that can be reasonably shrugged off. As an example, at risk 30, Eunectus can tank them without skill for a relatively long duration. Now onto the infiltrators, which many regard as the most cancerous enemy of the stage. Within the sandstorm, they gain art and physical dodge, and a lot of the times you will be killing them inside the sandstorm, so it becomes incredibly annoying, especially at the higher risks where there's a lot of RNG involved. One thing to note about these 3 enemies is that they spawn roughly in the same area, to the point where a well-placed Silverish skill 3 can take care of all of them, and that's one of the reasons he's very great here. Finally, we have the mascot of the stage, which is the duelist crocs or the Tekoa Braves. They are the stereotypical tanky boss enemy, with the gimmick that once you block them, they can only take damage from the blocker.
Risks wise, they either gain the ability to be invisible, or they stop lowering their own defense when blocked. Enough exposition about the enemies, let's talk about their pathings. When the stage starts, the generic crocodiles will go from the topmost red box and take the rightmost path towards the blue box. This is before the pillar marked X has been destroyed, and once the crocodile fighters destroy it, they will take the shorter leftmost path towards your blue box. This leads to the early game vanguard placements being relatively centered on these 4 tiles, depending on if you're talking about week 1 or week 2. It's important to note that after the dirt mound has been destroyed, the only enemies that will go on the right side path are the snipers, and that's towards the end of the map, so the recommendation is to not waste any DPS focusing on that area. All of the remaining enemies will come from the top side or the bottom side, and that is part of the reason why Chen Auto is so great in this CC, given that she can cover both lanes to an incredible extent. Right about the time when the dirt mounds are destroyed, the first duelist croc will spawn on the left side. This duelist croc will take longer to reach the blue box due to the fact that there's a dirt mound in its path and he will be forced to destroy it beforehand. Regarding strategies to counter the duelist croc, it differs between week 1 and week 2. For week 1, the tiles it passes through before it reaches the first dirt mound is not covered by the sandstorm, and therefore you can place units such as J, Monster, Heliger, etc. there to kill him. However, for week 2, most or all of the tiles in his lane will be covered by the sandstorm, and therefore it's recommended to just save your burst towards the end next to the blue box and use a combination of buffers and debuffers to take it down. This also works in week 1, except the tiles you get access to are the topmost tiles in that square in the middle of the map, so you can use units such as Kyobi, Ifrit, Saria, etc. Around the time where the first duelist croc would have reached the blue box, the first caster would spawn on the rightmost top side. It's important to note that this caster has immense range, and from all the way at the top lane, he can hit your bottommost operators, including the popular Chen auto placement. A bait or Nightingale is almost essential to survive this phase past the early risks. He will make his way slowly around the topside path where he can eventually be put into the hole depending on your strategy. When the caster is moving along its top path, a duelist croc will spawn and follow the bottom lane, while a sandstorm sniper will spawn and stay there, essentially deterring the placement of any operators in the sandstorm for more than a few seconds at a time. It should be noted that the place where the sandstorm sniper sits is accessible in week 2 via Silverash S3's range, but it's usually advised to delay Silverash until there are more critical enemies for him to slash at. When the second duelist croc is about to reach the blue box, the first infiltrator will spawn, and it will follow the topside path, but instead branch into the duelist croc's path. In higher risks, these enemies do pack a strong punch. Depending on strategy, it can be advisable for you to delay this infiltrator and have him line up with the third duelist croc in case you're going for some week 1 arts burst strategy. Speaking of the third croc, he spawns right around the time when the infiltrator enters his lane alongside another top caster. However, in the context of week 2 high risk, the duelist croc that comes along with the infiltrator, i.e. the third one, is the one that you're recommended to leak because your DPS just doesn't really line up for it well. The Silverash placement is recommended for week 2 when the second caster spawns alongside another one of these snipers so that he can take care of 2 snipers, 1 caster, as well as the pesky fighter crocs from the top lane. Following that phase of the stage, the fourth duelist croc will spawn, but this time he'll take an alternate route, branching off from his lane into the top lane. Week 1 strategies slightly stall this crocodile in order to line up their arts DPS with the 5th crocodile, which is the final one of the stage. And week 2 strategies, generally speaking, don't bother to line up their DPS due to the more restrictive nature of the tiles, not allowing you to have any sort of burst at the top side to counteract the caster, which would allow for some sort of mudrock stall. For most clears, once you've killed this croc, it's pretty simple from there. The only hard part you have left going for you is killing the last infiltrator and using a hooker to get the last caster down the hole. As for max risk strategies, however, the fun's only begun with the endless mudrock stalling for the final crocodile. With that, congratulations, you've cleared CC6, or at least have a general idea on how the map works. Now here's the segment where I talk about low risk and potential substitutions, but for this CC, given the fact that the most dangerous enemy are the casters, and casters at risk 18 kind of hit like wet toilet paper, this CC is surprisingly simple for low rarity. The best borrows are Eyjafjalla
Angelina, Couchstead, Thorns, and Surda. The focus is almost exclusively on one of two things, whether you can take care of all of the trash on the top side, or you can deal amazing damage to the Duelist Crocs to allow for your other team slots to deal with the trash on top. Some other notable mentions are Jay and Podenko, but I'll go more in depth about them in my lower rarity video. One thing to note is that in Risk 18, the easier strategy is to not leak any Duelist Crocs due to the fact that at such a low risk, they're generally just walking pools of HP. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope this helped you clear your CC6 and have a great day.